Welcome back, my friends, to Boring Rome. The place where we brush away the golden dust of legend to find the flesh and blood people who lived, loved, and suffered in the shadow of the empire. Tonight, our story is not about emperors or world-altering battles. It is much closer to the ground. It is the story of a pair of sandals, a set of shoulders, and a heart that beat strong and then grew hard over 25 years of service. This is the story of Gaius Valerius, a name as common as the millions of others that built the might of Rome. And it begins like so many stories do, not with the clash of a sword, but with an empty stomach. Join me as we travel back to a dusty morning in a small village in Gaul during the final years of the reign of Augustus. For Gaius, an 18-year-old boy, the future was as hazy as the dirt road in front of his home. His father's land was barren, just enough to support the eldest son who would inherit it. And him? He had his strength, the foolish bravery of youth, and the hard truth that if he stayed, he would be just another mouth to feed. But then, one day, a recruiting officer came to the village. He didn't speak of glory. He spoke of practical things. He spoke of the stipendium, a regular salary paid 3 times a year, a sum of money Gaius had never held in his hands. He spoke of the premia, a huge cash bonus or a fertile plot of land upon retirement, enough to start a new life. And most importantly, he spoke of the civitas Romana, Roman citizenship, a priceless privilege that would lift him and his children from the status of a provincial subject. For Gaius, it was not an invitation. It was an escape route. And so he left. He did not know that the decision made that day would take him to lands he had never heard of and would demand a price he could never have imagined. When Gaius arrived at the recruitment camp, he faced his first test, the probatio. He was ordered to strip, to stand naked before the officer and a medic.
They weren't just looking at his muscles. The medic checked his teeth, peered into his eyes in the sunlight to ensure he didn't have night blindness. He was made to run, to jump, to lift a heavy weight to test his stamina. But the officer was different. He stared into Gaius's eyes, searching for something deeper. He was searching for submission. He asked simple questions. What is your father's name? Can you read and write? Have you ever been a thief? Each of Gaius's answers was judged not by its content, but by his demeanor. Did he meet the officer's gaze? Did his voice tremble? Finally, the officer nodded. He'll do. That single phrase sealed Gaius's fate. The next step took place in a solemn silence before the Legion's standard, a glittering silver eagle perched atop a long staff. This was the Aquila, the very soul of the Legion. To lose it was worse than to lose a battle. Gaius was told to place his hand on the staff and repeat the oath, the sacramentum. His voice trembled as he echoed the ancient words. He swore to faithfully execute the commands of his officers. He swore never to desert, and he swore to be ready to die for the Roman Empire. When the last words were spoken, Gaius felt a shift. He no longer belonged to himself. He belonged to that silver eagle. But the true transformation came the next day. Gaius and the other recruits were led to a corner of the camp where a charcoal brazier glowed red. A large soldier with calloused hands was pulling a long iron rod from the fire with a pair of tongs. At its tip was the Legion's insignia. This was the signaculum, the mark. They were held down. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, screams of agony. When it was Gaius's turn, he clenched his teeth. The searing, tearing pain as the iron was pressed into his upper arm lasted only a few seconds, but it would stay with him forever. It was not just a scar, it was a mark of ownership. Now, no matter where he ran in the world, anyone who saw that mark would know him as a deserter, an oath-breaker. There was no going back. And then the real hell began, the training. The man in charge of this process was named Lucius Cornelius Scipio, but no one called him that. They called him the Vetus, the vine stick. The nickname came from the swagger stick made of grapevine wood he always carried, a symbol of a centurion's authority. That stick was not for show. It was for instruction. Scipio was a 20-year veteran who had risen from the ranks just like Gaius. He had fought in Germania, in Judea, and he had no patience for weakness. "Listen up, you maggots," he roared on that first morning. "You are not your mother's sons anymore. You are property of Rome. I will break you, and from the pieces I will forge soldiers. Those who cannot endure will die. There are always more to take your place." The first and longest lesson was marching. Scipio didn't call it walking. He called it measuring the empire with your feet. They began with the Gradus Militaris, 20 Roman miles, about 30 kilometers, in 5 summer hours. They didn't march empty-handed. They carried a heavy sandbag. On the first day, Gaius thought he would die. His lungs burned, his muscles screamed, and his sandals, the caligae, the thick-soled leather boots designed for ventilation, became instruments of torture as pebbles constantly worked their way inside, cutting into the soles of his feet.
Many men collapsed. Scipio did not help them up. He brought his vitus down across their backs. Get up. Pain is just weakness leaving the body. Once they had mastered the military pace, they moved to the Gradus Planus, the full pace, nearly 40 kilometers in the same time, still with the sandbags. After a month, Gaius's body changed. His skin darkened, his muscles hardened into knots. The pain was still there, but it became a familiar, constant companion. Next came the weapons, but Scipio did not give them shining steel glodii. He gave them wooden swords and wicker shields. Gaius almost dropped them. They were twice the weight of the real equipment. "Why?" a brave recruit asked. Scipio smiled a terrifying smile. "Because after you have swung this 1,000 times, a real gladius will feel as light as a feather in your hand." They were taught to fight in the most boring way imaginable. No heroic sweeping slashes. "Slashing is for barbarians," Scipio bellowed. "It creates wide, shallow wounds, and it leaves your body open." A Roman soldier thrusts, straight, fast, efficient. They practiced on a wooden stake called the pullus, for hours every day, under the blazing sun. It was the same repetitive motion. Shield up, step in, thrust straight into the chest of the stake, pull back, step out. Faster, harder. Your enemy will not wait for you to catch your breath. They learn to become part of something larger, the testudo formation, the tortoise. Gaius and dozens of others would press together, their rectangular shields interlocking over their heads and on their sides, creating a mobile armored shell. Stones and practice spears were thrown at them, bouncing off harmlessly. Inside the tortoise, Gaius felt claustrophobic, but safe. He understood his strength was not his own, but that of the man to his left and to his right. It was about absolute trust. And then they learned to dig. Gaius had never imagined joining the army to do a farmer's work. But it was worse. Every afternoon, after an exhausting day of training, they were marched to an empty field and ordered to build a camp. They had to dig a shoulder-deep ditch, use the earth to build a rampart, and plant sharpened stakes on top. They had to do it at astonishing speed. The enemy doesn't give you time to rest, Scipio would remind them with his stick. Gaius learned to use a pickaxe, a shovel, and more complex skills. He learned to build a simple wooden bridge over a stream. He learned how to lay a Roman road with its carefully packed layers of stone. He realized that a Roman legion was not just an army. It was a mobile engineering corps. They did not conquer with the sword alone. They conquered with roads, with bridges, with forts. They conquered by imposing order and discipline on a chaotic world. 4 months passed in a blur of agony. Gaius survived. He was thinner, but wiry and hard. His skin was burned by the sun. His hands were covered in calluses. His eyes no longer held the naivety of a farm boy. In its place was a vacant, disciplined emptiness. He had been broken and reforged in a new image. One morning, Scipio gathered them. There was no shouting. He looked at them, a slight nod. "You are no longer maggots," he said. "Now you are legionaries." It was the only compliment he ever heard from him, and it was worth more than any gold coin. The forging was complete. The real part of his life, the endless grind of service, was about to begin.
Gaius's forging was complete. He and the other survivors were formally inducted into the 9th Legion Hispana, one of Rome's oldest and most seasoned legions. And their first order was not to go into battle. It was to march. A months-long march from Italy through Gaul to their new posting, a cold, damp frontier at the very edge of the civilized world, Britannia. This was when Gaius truly understood what it meant to be a soldier, and it was nothing like he had imagined. It did not smell of glory. It had a smell, a very particular smell. It was the smell of the sour sweat of thousands of men who hadn't properly bathed, the smell of damp leather, the smell of the oil used to rust-proof armor, and above all, the smell of posca. Posca was the standard army-issued drink. It was, essentially, the cheapest wine, already turning to vinegar, diluted with water. The officers claimed it was healthy, that it purified unsafe drinking water. But to Gaius, it tasted like medicine, and it was the flavor of poverty. He learned a small trick from an older veteran. Add a few bitter herbs to your water skin. It didn't make the posca taste good, but at least it made it taste different. It was a small victory in a long day. And the days were long. The march was an endless cycle, a meditation in physical misery. Gaius quickly learned that a legionary's greatest enemy was not a barbarian tribe, but his own equipment. The nearly 100-pound load was known ironically as the impedimenta, the hindrances. Another veteran, a wiry man named Titus with a sour sense of humor, showed Gaius how to pack it. "Listen, kid," Titus whispered one evening. "Never let your cooking pot bang against your sword. It'll clank all day and drive you mad. Shove your cleaning rag between them. And that pickaxe, lash it tight to the pole, or it'll keep hitting you in the back of the head on every downhill slope." Advice like that was more precious than gold. It was knowledge passed down through generations of legionaries, the small secrets to surviving the daily torture. Gaius also learned the importance of his feet. The Calige sandals were a marvel of design, but also a nightmare. The iron hubnails on the soles gave them good grip, but they also conducted temperature. Marching on a stone road under the Gallic summer sun, Gaius felt as if the soles of his feet were being slowly cooked. On cold mornings, the nails were like ice. Every evening, the most important ritual was not eating, but foot care. He would soak them in cold water if he could find it, rub them, and inspect every blister. An infected blister could make him fall behind, and nobody wanted to fall behind. The boredom of the march was so thick you could feel it. To fight it, the soldiers invented their own games. They would bet on the most meaningless things. What kind of bird would be the next to fly past? How many times the centurion would shout in the next hour? Whether the lead man would step in horse manure? They also sang, not heroic marching anthems, but crude satirical songs about their generals, about the terrible food, about the girls they missed. Their singing was out of tune and rough, but it was the sound of camaraderie, a way to affirm that they were still human, not just machines. And then every evening came the work of building the camp. It was done with a terrifying efficiency. Centurion Scipio would never accept a crooked ditch or a sloppy palisade. He'd roar, "A careless camp is an invitation to the barbarians. It tells them we are tired and sloppy, and they will come. Dig as if your life depends on it, because it does." During this construction work, Gaius learned of another informal system in the legion, the immunes. These were soldiers who were exempt from the grueling manual labor because they had a special skill. There were immunes who were carpenters, blacksmiths, even doctors. Gaius envied them. But he also learned that being an immunis had its own price. The blacksmith had to work by a scorching forge even on the hottest days. The doctor had to deal with horrific wounds. One of Gaius's closest friends in his 8-man squad, his contubernium, was a young man named Marcus who had a talent for beautiful handwriting. Marcus became the squad's unofficial scribe. He helped them write letters home. The soldiers, most of them illiterate, would dictate their words of love, their complaints, their lies about their glorious lives. Marcus would carefully record them on scraps of papyrus or wax tablets. Then they would have to find a merchant or a messenger heading south to carry the letters with the faint hope they would reach their destination in a few months. For Gaius, receiving a letter from home was a rare and precious event, a thin thread connecting him to the world he had left behind. Dinner was the only time of day they could truly be themselves. Gaius's squad, 8 men crammed into a single leathered tent, was like a strange family. They shared their monotonous grain porridge, which they sarcastically called Caesar's delicacy. They complained about Centurion Scipio. They told exaggerated stories of their own prowess, and they gambled. Gambling was forbidden in the army, but it was everywhere. They played with dice made from animal bones. They bet their few sestertius coins. Gaius usually lost, but he still played, because for those few minutes he could forget his reality. He could feel a sliver of excitement, a sliver of control over his own fate. It was a life of contradictions. They were the builders of empire, but they lived in temporary tents. They brought the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, to new lands, but their own lives were a brutal cycle of labor and discipline. They fought for Rome, but in their hearts they only dreamed of a small plot of land and a quiet life. And so the cycle continued. Wake, eat, march, build, eat, sleep, watch. Day after day, week after week. The monotony was no longer an enemy. It became the very nature of existence. Gaius learned to find the smallest joys, a day without rain, a night without guard duty, or an onion that Titus had managed to steal from a local farm. He was becoming hardened. He no longer remembered much of his previous life. The smell of damp earth, the taste of Pascha, the weight of the pack on his shoulders, that was the real world. He was becoming part of the machine. And he did not know that the machine was about to carry him to a place where the boredom ended and a completely different kind of horror began.
After months of marching, the endless cycle of Gaius's life finally came to a breaking point. The Ninth Legion had cornered a confederation of Briton tribes in a dense northern forest. There were no straight Roman roads here, only mud and ancient gnarled oaks. The air no longer smelled of sweat and leather, but of cold metal, damp earth, and something more primal, fear. Centurion Scipio was no longer shouting. His voice was now low and sharp. "Tonight, sharpen your swords. Check every nail on your sandals. Sleep if you can, because tomorrow many of you will not see the sunset." It was a sleepless night. Gaius sat in his tent, running a whetstone along the edge of his gladius. It didn't feel light as a feather anymore. It felt cold and heavy. He thought of his family. He wondered if the letter Marcus had written for him months ago had ever arrived. But there were fears more real than the enemy ahead. There was the fear of Rome's own discipline. Gaius had seen it. A few weeks prior, a young recruit, terrified, had fallen asleep on watch. He wasn't beaten by Scipio's vine stick. The punishment was far more brutal. It was called the fustuarium. The boy was stripped of his armor and pushed into a corridor formed by his own comrades. And then, one by one, the soldiers who had eaten with him and slept next to him were ordered to beat him to death with clubs and stones. It was a slow, humiliating death. Gaius had been forced to take part. He had thrown a stone, closing his eyes. The boy's screams still haunted his dreams. Its message was clear. The failure of one was the failure of all, and the legion would purge its own weak links. It was better to die at the hands of the enemy than at the hands of your brothers. And there were punishments for the collective. If a unit fought poorly, they could face decimation. 1 in every 10 men, chosen by lot, would be beaten to death by the other 9. It was a terrifying lottery, a reminder that courage was not just for victory, but for preserving the lives of yourself and your friends. The dawn came cold and gray. The battle began. It was unlike anything Gaius had ever experienced. He looked across the shield wall and saw his enemy. They were no longer vague figures from stories. They were real. Tall men with wild hair and beards, many of them bare-chested despite the cold, their bodies painted with strange blue swirling patterns. They had no iron armor, only small wooden shields and heavy axes or long swords. But in their eyes was a wild fire that Gaius had never seen in any Roman. They were not fighting for a salary or a plot of land. They were fighting for their homes. For the first time, Gaius felt a reluctant respect for them.
The Roman horns blew their orderly calls, but they were drowned out by the roar of thousands of Britons. They didn't fight in lines. They were a tidal wave of fury. "Hold the line," Scipio roared. The first wave of Pila was thrown. Gaius felt a satisfying thud as his javelin slammed into the wooden shield of an onrushing warrior. As designed, its soft iron shank bent downwards, making the shield a heavy, useless encumbrance.
But then they hit. The impact almost took Gaius's breath away. It was a wall of flesh, shield slamming against shield. He could see nothing but the shield in front of him and the hate-filled eyes of the enemy in the gap above it. The smell of blood, sweat, and stale breath filled his nostrils. He acted on instinct, thrust, recover, block. He didn't know who he was stabbing or if he connected. He just knew that if he stopped, he would die. Next to him, Titus, the humorous veteran, gave a choked cry and fell, a spear through his throat. The spear was not a mass-produced pilum. It was crude, made of ash wood with a simple iron tip. A farmer's weapon. Gaius had a sickening realization. He was being killed by men exactly like his own father and brother. There was no time to mourn. The soldier from the rank behind immediately stepped forward to fill the gap. Battle was not a series of heroic duels. It was a brutal shoving match. Gaius now understood the core difference. The Britons fought to kill. The Romans fought to survive, to hold the line. When a Briton warrior fell, another would leap forward with twice the fury. But when a Roman soldier fell, the gap was filled silently, methodically. It was a clash between individual rage and collective discipline. And Gaius didn't know which would win. The danger wasn't just from the front. Gaius learned about the mysterious deaths of the battlefield. A soldier could suddenly fall with no obvious wound. Later, veterans would explain. In the chaos, a soldier could be accidentally stabbed by a comrade in the rank behind him. Or worse, during a surge, he could trip and be trampled to death by hundreds of hobnailed sandals, crushed under the feet of his own legion. Gaius was lucky. He survived. When the orderly call of the horn signaled a retreat, he could barely stand. He was sent to the field hospital, and there the horror did not end. The place was not clean. It reeked of blood, herbs, and gangrene. He saw a medicus performing an amputation on a soldier's shattered leg. There was no anesthetic. The man was held down by 4 others, a leather strap in his mouth to bite on. The grating sound of the bone saw and the man's muffled screams were the most terrifying sounds Gaius had ever heard. He learned that the deadliest dangers were not enemy swords. They were invisible. A small cut, if not cleaned with wine or vinegar, could become infected and swell. Days later, the soldier would die in a delirious fever. Dysentery from bad water could wipe out a cohort faster than any enemy. And camp fever, a general term for the infectious diseases that ran rampant in the cramped and unsanitary conditions.
But there was one death more mysterious and feared. The veterans called it the Roman sadness. A soldier, physically unharmed, would, after a long campaign, suddenly grow silent. He would stop eating, stop talking, and just stare into space. A few weeks later, he would be found dead in his tent for no apparent reason. It was a collapse of the spirit, when the will to live had been completely eroded by the grind of war. Gaius saw all of this. He survived the battles, the harsh Britain winters, the diseases, and the ever-present threat of the Roman sadness. He buried Titus and many other friends. The scars on his body multiplied, and so did the scars on his mind. 25 years was an eternity. When Gaius finally received his discharge papers, he was a different man. He looked at his reflection in the polished surface of his helmet and no longer recognized the farm boy. His eyes were empty, but held a hardness that nothing could break. He took his plot of land, his reward for a lifetime of service. But as he stood on that land, he did not feel joy. He felt lost. He was used to orders, to schedules, to the sound of the horn. This sudden freedom was terrifying. He didn't know how to talk to civilians. Their stories of crops and family seemed so small compared to what he had endured. And at night, the silence was the worst enemy. In that silence, he could hear the screams of battle, the sound of the bone saw in the field hospital, and the cries of the young recruit who had been stoned to death. The price of the eagle, the symbol he had sworn to serve, was steep. The empire was built on the foundations of millions of lives like Gaius's, lives that had been crushed, hardened, and forever changed by discipline, boredom, and unspeakable horror. And so our journey alongside Gaius comes to an end. We leave him on his small plot of land, looking out at an unfamiliar sky. The sounds of battle have faded. The centurion's shouts are gone. There are no more marches, no more camps to build. There is only the silence. And in that silence, what remains? The pride of having served, the ghosts of fallen comrades, the dull ache in his bones. The story of Rome is written not just in the triumphs of its generals, but in the quiet endurance of millions of men like this. The men who traded their lives for the promise of something better, and who paid the price in sweat, blood, and boredom. Now, let the story of Gaius fade away. Let the sounds of the marching feet dissolve into the distance. There is no more discipline to endure, no more walls to build. There is only the stillness of this moment, the safety of your own space. Feel the weight of your own body at rest, heavy and calm. Feel the rhythm of your own breath, in and out, a simple, natural cycle. Let go of the day. Let go of all the thoughts and all the worries. You have marched far enough. The work is done. It is time for rest, a deep and peaceful rest, deserved and earned. Sleep now.